in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on Special Collections Cataloging for Maps. I'm Erin Elsie, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Carolyn Hansen. Carolyn is an independent librarian and historian with expertise in descriptive cataloging of cartographic resources. Carolyn trained in map cataloging at the American Geographical Society Library and worked as map cataloger at the Brooklyn Historical Society. Previously, Carolyn also held positions as head of cataloging and metadata services at Stony Brook University and metadata librarian at the University of Cincinnati and Eastern Washington University. Carolyn has been cataloging special collections for over 12 years and is currently working on a book project that will be the first historical atlas of Brooklyn. Carolyn brings much expertise to today's topic, and we are fortunate to have her with us. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE, or you can also see it there bolded right now near the middle of your screen. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for Carolyn, please type them into the question box in your go-to control panel on your screen. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now we'll turn it over to Carolyn. Note that there will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Hello, and welcome to Special Collections Cataloging for Maps. Thank you, Erin, for that wonderful introduction. My name is Carolyn Hansen, and I am very excited to be here to talk to you about one of my very favorite things, which is the Special Collections Cataloging of Maps. A little bit more about me. As you heard previously from the introduction, I trained in map cataloging at the American Geographical Society Library and have held positions in cataloging and metadata services at a couple of universities. I've been cataloging special collections for over 12 years. I specialize in cartographic resources. My research interests include digital humanities, digital mapping, historical geography of Brooklyn, and the ethics of metadata and linked data. So in today's presentation, we're going to go through a number of topics. The first is that we'll have just a basic introduction to rare and unique maps, talking about what they are and how they differ from standard maps. Then we'll move on to some examples and map terminology and components. This webinar assumes that you may not have ever worked with a map other than on Google Maps or in your life and in your travels. So we'll talk a little bit about what the terminology is for map components. And then we'll speak about map cataloging content standards and best practices, the differences between standard map cataloging and rare or unique map cataloging, some good to know map cataloging tips that I have sort of accumulated over time. And we'll talk lastly about map cataloging research tools and how to create successful cataloging workflows. So a quick note, rare and unique cartographic resources can include a wide variety of materials, such as globes, plans, map series, atlases, remote sensing images, views, etc. And due to time, this presentation will focus primarily on single sheet maps, or a map that is complete in several sheets, but is not a series. Both CM, which is the cataloging manual for cartographic materials, and DCRMC, the descriptive manual for cataloging cartographic resources, deal with these other types of resources. And there are also plenty of online resources that you can use to learn about how to catalog these other types of materials. So what is a rare map? A rare map can be a bit of a ambiguous or elusive subject, we're generally referring to resources that were created before the rise of machine printing in the 19th century. But a rare map can include contemporary materials depending on what your institution's needs and collections are. For example, you may have modern manuscript maps, you may have 20th century gas maps or 20th century plans that are very important for your institution and require more descriptive cataloging to bring out the important access points in those materials. You may decide that you have collections that all collections will require a specific level of cataloging, or you may decide piecemeal that different types of collections require greater levels of granularity in description. And this last point is very important. A rare unique map is a resource that has bibliographical or artifactual value in addition to the value of the content. So the process in which the material was created, the map as object, is an important component of defining what makes that material rare. So the Ferber tasks for users that we use to create catalog records are, the 4 tasks are find, select, identify, and obtain. And those tasks are a little bit different for rare and unique maps and other types of materials. And this impacts the description that we use in catalog records. This is from DCRMC, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. But let's start with this because I think this is a good grounding in theory of what we're looking for when we're cataloging. So first, users must be able to distinguish clearly among different manifestations of an expression of a work. When dealing with rare materials, there may be very small differences between different manifestations. And this information needs to be brought out in catalog records in order for individuals or groups to be able to find if the resources that they're looking for are represented in that catalog record. Second, users must be able to perform most identification and selection tasks without direct access to the materials. Third, users must be able to investigate physical processes and post-production history and context exemplified in materials described. And last, users must be able to gain access to materials whose production or presentation characteristics differ from modern conventions. So again, we're thinking about the resource as an artifact or an object. The process in which it was created, the printing process, is important. Any type of binding or annotations or things that make that material special are also going to be important in the cataloging of that resource. So we're going to talk a little bit about some common map terminology now. These are some of the basic components of a map that you'll be seeing. So the first is a neat line. This is a line, it's usually a grid. It encloses the detail of a map. And after we talk about these common terminologies, we'll go through some examples of diagramming early maps so that you can see what these look like in the real world. The second is a cartouche. This is a panel on a map, usually with decoration. They're usually quite ornate. They enclose title panels, legends, scales, etc. The third is scale. This is the ratio of distances on a cartographic resource to the actual distances they represent. They may be represented graphically on the resource. For example, you may see a bar scale. It may be represented as a fraction. So an example would be 1 to 50,000, or verbally. So 1 inch equals 200 feet. Next is map projection. This is any systematic arrangement of meridians and parallels portraying the curved surface of the sphere or spheroid upon a plane. So map projection is a very important component of all cartographic resources. If we're dealing with a map that is flat, obviously the Earth is a sphere, and so there is going to be a distortion that happens when that sphere is flattened. And we may be familiar with the Mercator projection, which is infamous for really presenting some distorted images of land masses. For example, Greenland is much larger than it actually is. Next is geographic coordinates. So we have coordinates on the Earth in terms of latitude and longitude. The recto and the verso of a map. So the side of the map that's meant to be read first is called the recto, and if there's content on the reverse side of the map, that is called the verso. And lastly is the state. When referring to maps, a state is an impression that varies from another impression from the same plate or another printing surface because of some change in the plate. So for example, if I have a map of the United States from 1850, and I am using a particular metal plate that I have engraved and I'm printing different copies from that plate. If I make any change to that plate, such as a spelling change, or I add detail to the plate, and then I reissue the map, that could be a different state of the map. So it's somewhat like an addition in a monograph, but it's a little bit different, and it really applies specifically to the hand press period. Next is an inset. An inset is a separate map that's positioned within the neat line of a larger map. So you can see in the left-hand bottom corner of the screen, we have two inset maps that are showing content within the larger map. So we have a map of New York State and some other states within the Mid-Atlantic and New England. And then we have two inset maps, one of Boston Harbor and one of New York Harbor. So if I was cataloging this map, I would include a 500 note that would say includes two insets, and then I could indicate what the insets were, and I could indicate the inset's scale or other information about that inset if I wanted to. Next is a location map. This is a small scale map inset that's placed in the margin, the map at a larger scale to show the location of the area represented by the latter. So in this example, we have a cadastral or property map of the city of Brooklyn from, I don't have the exact date on this, but it's probably roughly the 1860s or 1870s. And what we're seeing is that we have an executive sale of a particular set of lots, and then the location map shows if we're looking at a larger geographic entity of where the main content of the map is in context with the rest of the borough of Brooklyn. Next is relief. Relief is inequalities of elevation and the configuration of land features. And there are a number of different types of relief that we're looking at right now. Some of the most common that you'll see in early maps are pictorial. So pictorial is an illustrative representation of relief as it would be if we were actually on the earth in the map. And then hatchers, which are often kind of cross-hatched marks that may appear in circles. Spot heights, which indicate a certain level of elevation. So if you were looking at a map of Nepal, you might have Mount Everest, and then you would see 28,000 feet for the spot height. Soundings, which is the sort of opposite of a spot height. So the sounding is the depth in the water. These are generally seen in nautical charts and other maps that show underwater relief. There is always a need to put a note in your bibliographic record if you have relief on your map. So for example, if I had a map that had hatchers, I would have a 500 note that said relief shown by hatchers. If I also had depths shown by soundings, I could say 500 note depths shown by soundings in feet or fathoms, which are generally the abbreviations that you'll see in maps that were created in either North America or English-speaking Europe. So let's look at some examples of some early maps of New York City and North America. This first map is a map of North America from approximately 1699. And what you'll see immediately is that this is a very colorful map. This is likely to have been hand-colored. And when we look at some of the components of the map, first on this sort of top margin, we have geographic coordinates that are represented. We also have a prime meridian. So this information generally isn't included unless the prime meridian shown is different than Greenwich, although it certainly can be included in a 500 note. We have a cartouche. So again, we talked about having a very decorative illustration surrounding a title panel or other information on the map. In early maps, particularly of North America, this often shows different flora and fauna from the area. This was a way of making the map more aesthetically appealing and to encourage it to be purchased. It was also a way of sort of having early travel logs of giving information about what these new places looked like. So this would include, this could be included in a 500 note, such as includes cartouche. And then we also have pictorial relief. So you'll see we're pointing at these drawings of mountains. Your 500 note could be relief shown pictorially. We also have a decorative illustration of a sea animal. This could also be included in a 500 note. Our next map is a facsimile of a manuscript map that was created in the early 1600s of Manhattan. And there are a number of components to bring out in this map. The first is the compass rose, which indicates where the direction of north is. And please note that not all maps are oriented to the north. Second is the index, which is included in this sort of separate inset. Indexes are brought out in 500 notes. Generally, we'll only have one includes note in a bibliographic record. So your 500 note could say includes 2 insets, index, cartouche. It could be quite expansive depending on the content that you have on the map. And generally, that information is going to be different if the content is on the recto or the verso. So for example, if I have a map that has content on both the recto and the verso, and I have insets on both sides, I wouldn't include both of those insets in one includes note. I would have 2 notes, 2 separate 500s that would say something like includes inset, and then I would have a separate 500 note that says on verso, inset, and then whatever other contents of the map I had. In the lower left-hand corner of this slide, we'll see the neat line, which is again the line that may surround the map. Content may extend beyond the neat line. You may also have a situation where there is no neat line. So this will determine whether and how you measure the map. So generally, when you're measuring maps, you'll measure within the neat line, but you may have to measure by the sheet if the content extends past the neat line. And lastly, we have a reproduction statement. This was in very small print in the left-hand corner of the map, and you'll see the original title and that it's a facsimile from the Library of Congress. So this could be brought out in a 500 note that says facsimile of manuscript map, and then you would want to include the title of the original map and the original date of publication elsewhere within the bibliographic record. This next map was created by Bernard Ratzer. It was published in 1776, again of Manhattan and a small portion of Brooklyn. We'll see a couple of things that I'd like to bring out. The first is that there's, again, a very small printed statement of responsibility in the lower right margin of the map. It says T Kitchen Sculpt. A sculpt is an abbreviation for engraver. And we'll talk more about these abbreviations later in the presentation, but I'd just like to point out that in rare and unique map cataloging, it's much more common to bring out things like engravers and printers, and to also ascribe some of the responsibility for the creation of the map to those individuals. So for example, Thomas Kitchen could be a 245 subfield C, which in a modern map is probably more unlikely that you would have that kind of representation of responsibility for someone that was involved in the production of the resource. Second, we have hand coloring. This is brought out in the 300 subfield B, where you can indicate that the map was hand colored. Maps that are colored, that information is also brought out in the 007 coded physical description information. In the lower left-hand corner, we'll see physical relief. This is relief shown by hatchers, which again would be brought out in a 500 note. And you'll see that those hatchers are in the circular shape. And then in the lower right-hand corner, we have the scale bar. This is an example. So the scale is represented in the MARC record in 2 fields, the 034 and the 255. The 034 is a coded mathematical field. So in this case, the first subfield is A, and if there's scale, it simply has an A in the first subfield. And the second subfield just has the numeric value without any type of punctuation. And then you would also include geographic coordinates if you had those for that resource. And then in the 255 is your scale statement. So you'll see this is the scale circa 19 to 800. And please note that the 255 was previously the 507 field. So you may see, if you're looking at older records, you may see scale written out in a 507. That field is no longer used. So let's look at some examples of different types of maps. The first is a nautical chart. And a nautical chart was a chart that was designed to assist navigation at sea or on other waterways. And here's an example of a 17th century nautical chart showing Hudson Bay and some of the areas of Quebec. And you'll notice that there's quite a bit of detail in the water area. You'll see that there are soundings as well as bathymetric tints to indicate water depth, as well as a tidal cartouche and a compass rose. And this map additionally is hand colored. Next is a nautical chart from the US Coast and Geodetic Survey, which created a number of nautical charts from the mid 19th century to the early 20th century. These are really beautiful resources, and again show quite a bit of information within the waterways, showing soundings, isolines, which are sort of like contour lines but underwater, as well as bathymetric tints. Next is manuscript maps. These are maps written by hand. This first example is an example showing land near the Delaware River in the 18th century. And this is a good example of why you may have to do quite a bit of research if you're working with manuscript maps. You may have a situation in an institution where manuscript maps were removed from archival collections as well. So when that happens, it's important to make determination with the archivist about whether you'd like to reunite those resources, or if you'll have item level description and some sort of linking between the individual map records and the archival collection. Second is a map of Budapest that was created by a man named Ladislas Digo in the 20th century. And again, you'll notice that this is an example where you might have to do quite a bit of research to figure out what you're looking at, because the content can be pretty idiosyncratic or difficult to understand upon first viewing. Next is a cadastral map. This is a map that delineates property boundaries. And you'll see these often in this format, which is similar to a broadside or advertisement, particularly in the 19th century. So these were created when large land plots were divvied up to be sold. You'll see that there's information about the names of the previous estate owners, as well as information about the size and dimensions of the lot that's being sold. Now, in my own cataloging, I've come across a number of these that were a little bit tricky in that they were somewhat more broadside than map. So you might have quite a bit of text and a very small map. And so in those situations, I have chosen to create local policies about dealing with those resources to say that if there is more text than map, they, to me, are broadside and will be cataloged in a monograph format, as opposed to a map format. But that was my personal decision at my institution, and others may have a different feeling that if there's any map content, the resource should be cataloged as a map. This next resource is, again, another of these sort of broadside-y maps. We're noticing that this particular resource has a couple of things I'd like to bring out. One is annotations. These are really common in special collections resources. They're not necessarily to be put into the main bibliographic master record, but there's something that we'll want to bring out in local notes. This also has hand coloring, and it's also an imperfect copy. It appears to have been cut or divvied up from a larger piece. And we'll talk more about imperfect copies in a little bit. Pictorial maps. Pictorial maps are a map in which features are represented by individual pictures in elevation or perspective, rather than by conventionalized cartographic symbols. So these are really illustrative maps, They tend to be used for tourism. This is a map of Long Island, again, a map that was extracted from a larger resource. This appears to have been taken from some sort of magazine and shows a number of illustrations on Long Island. Again, this is more of a piece of art than it's meant to be a accurate representation of the geography of Long Island. And next we have one of my very favorite maps of all time. This is a pictorial map of Loveland, created by a man named Ernest Dudley Chase. Ernest Dudley Chase was a illustrator and cartographer. Oops, we're having some background noise, I'm sorry about that. Let's see what's going on. So we have the pictorial map of Loveland, which was created by Ernest Dudley Chase and shows an imaginary space. So a map may not necessarily be, again, an accurate representation of a physical area. So let's talk a little bit about map cataloging standards. There are two primary standards that we use when we're cataloging maps. The first is RDA and the second is DRMC. And these are expressed in the 040 field in the MARC catalog record. So first is RDA. RDA is Resource Description and Access. As most of us know, it's the primary cataloging standard of the library community. The dynamic version is available via subscription to RDA Toolkit. There are pros and cons of RDA. The pro is that a cataloger can create records more quickly than with the rare cataloging standard DCRMC. One of the cons is that the record may be less in depth, and it may omit information that makes the resource more findable. The second is DCRMC. So this is the descriptive cataloging of rare materials cartographic. It was created by the map cataloging community based on DCRMB, which is the descriptive cataloging of rare materials books, and CM, which is cartographic materials, and the primary cataloging guideline for map cataloging. The pros for DCRMC is that your records will have greater depth, and it makes it easier to accomplish the user tasks for rare materials. DCRMC records can be created at either minimal or full level. So that's important to consider as well, whether you'll be creating records in DCRMC with greater depth or at the minimal level. The cons is that the records can take longer to create, and they may require more specialized skills on the part of the cataloger. Also, it's important to note that DCRMC is an AACR2 based standard. It's not RDA compliant. So some of the things that we may really appreciate about RDA, for example, the lack of abbreviations that make, for example, a 264 more understandable without SLSN, you'll see those abbreviations in DCRMC. So one of the important decisions you need to make when you're in your pre-cataloging state is which standards should you use? And again, we talked about this earlier, you can apply the standard selectively, so to specific collections as opposed to having a blanket decision that applies to the entire collection. So questions to ask in making these decisions: first, what is the relevance of the items awaiting cataloging to the institution's mission and the needs of its users? I think this is a really great question. Obviously, the more important the item is in terms of its relevance to an institution's mission, the more description you would like of the resource, but there's also a need to make sure that that resource is available and accessible to users as quickly as possible. So there's a tension there that needs to be resolved in any institution. Second, is your staff able to work concurrently with more than one cataloging code or description level? It can be very difficult to move back and forth between different standards, so that's one thing to consider as well. Third, how many other projects are in process and what are their requirements and priorities? And last, is your staff able to keep up with the inflow of new materials? Again, records that are created with DCRMC at the full level will take more time to create. I'll talk quickly about some other standards that are used for subject access. The first is LCTF, which is the Library of Congress Genre Form Thesaurus, which is used to bring out broad genres or forms within a resource. This is a little bit interesting. LCTF was created relatively recently, and we're still seeing terms within the map community that are set up in the authority file as 185s, and those are represented in subfield V in the 651 or 650, such as maps. But we also have many of these previously 185 authority records have been changed to be 155s, which are then represented as 655s in the subject access fields. So for example, there used to be a subfield V that you could use that was maps, topographical. That no longer exists and has been converted to a 155 for topographical maps. In this example, we have a 651 for Brooklyn, New York maps, and then we have a 650 for roads, New York State, New York. And I just would like to note that you cannot geographically subdivide in a 650 below the city level. So if you're ever working on neighborhoods, you're not able to geographically subdivide to that level. And then we have two separate genre headings, one for road maps and one for maps. And it's up to individual institutions whether they feel that that separate 655 of maps is redundant. It could be, I think, a decision that could be made either way. And you probably want to make a decision for how you'd like to handle copy cataloging coming in, such as accepting the resource record as it is, or sorry, that is my dog. That's the problem with working from home, right? The other standard is AAT. So AAT is the, oh, and this is an error. So AAT is not the Library of Congress genre form thesaurus. It is the Getty's Art and Architecture thesaurus, which is also used to bring out broad genres or forms. We'll see the example that we saw previously with Brooklyn, New York maps, and roads, New York State, New York maps, but we'll see we have two separate 655s. One is road maps and one is maps, parentheses, documents. Another standard is the RBMS controlled vocabularies. RBMS is the rare book and manuscript section of ACRL, and this is used often to bring out the artifactual components of a resource or the map as object idea. So in this same example, we have the same 651 and 650 we saw in the previous example, but we also have a 655 for lithographs. You could have the 655 for other types of headings that brought out the artifactual components of the production processes that were used to create the map. So standard versus rare and unique map cataloging, what stays the same and what's different? So what stays the same is that the basic elements and structure of description, whether you're using a MARC or a different encoding standard, will be the same. For MARC, this includes, and this is just sort of a general list of some of the most common fields that are used in map records, the coded physical description in the 007, 1XX fields, 245, 250, 264, scale, which is represented in both the 034 and the 255, the 300, 500 notes, and subject headings in the 6XX. What's different is that there's going to be more of an emphasis on transcription in rare and unique map cataloging, more of an emphasis on having as much detail within the bibliographic record as is reasonable to be able to provide access to the resource. So that will include more name tracing. We talked a little bit about this already. So more tracing of names related to publishers, engravers, and map producers. We'll have more notes. The note field is very important for maps. We'll have notes on geographic coverage. We'll have notes on the different components of the maps. We'll have notes on relief. We'll have notes on different manufacturers. We'll have more granularity of description. There's also more research that's going to be required in order to make these decisions. For example, when looking at multiple states of a map, you may need to do quite a bit of research to find out which state you're actually looking at. Also, early resources tend to be missing information, or missing information is not easily available. So for example, one of the first maps we saw, which was a map of North America, had a map maker that created the map, but none of that information is available on the resource itself. So you'd be required to look at research materials in order to find out what, who created that map. And there's also more working with imperfect copies, which is an important consideration as well. So let's talk about some good to know cataloging tips. The first is imperfect copies and local notes. So it's very common for rare and unique maps to be imperfect. They may be missing portions, they may be illegible due to fading, they may be physically damaged due to outdated preservation methods. It was very common previously to varnish with a sort of shellac material. This can cause discoloration of maps. It can cause the maps to become very brittle. Mounting, it was also common to mount maps on linen. Tape, you may see masking tape, scotch tape, duct tape. I've kind of seen it all in terms of what people have used to keep maps together. You also may be dealing with maps that are physically difficult to open, particularly if they've been rolled very tightly or stored in areas that did not have good climate control. So most often, whether you're using RDA or DCRMC, this information about imperfect copies is put in a local note, unless you're doing original cataloging and you cannot base your description on a perfect copy. So we have an example here of a 500 note that says description based on an imperfect copy. Section of map is missing at top, affecting the text. And I've had to do this very often where you have to indicate that your material is imperfect. So here's an example. We're looking, and there's a 590 field that could be used if you were not doing original cataloging based on this copy. That would say something like library copy, missing portion of lower right corner. Here's an example of a blueprint that the copy is very faded and much of the map is illegible. This is an example of a library copy map that is varnished and mounted on linen. This information used to be somewhat contained in a 300 subfield B if the map was being originally cataloged, but DCRMC has asked that information related to a library copy that its physical characteristics such as varnishing and mounting be included in local notes as opposed to in the master record. Next is good to know early printing abbreviations. These are very commonly used, and if you've never seen them before, they may be a bit confusing. Some of the most common that I've seen in my cataloging is DEL or DELIN for drawn by, ENG or ENGD for engraved by, IMP for printed by, lith or litho or lithog, and sculpt. So these are really helpful to have just a reference guide with you in your cataloging so that you're able to figure out what the responsibility is of the individual or the group in the production of the resource. So the next thing that I'd like to talk about that's good to know is the role of printers and publishers in imprints. And this was a bit confusing to me when I started working with map cataloging, because in the modern context, printers and publishers have can have very separate roles. So there's the role of publication and there's the role of manufacturing. And this role was much more fluid in the hand press period. So for example, DCRMC says the role of publishers, printers, and booksellers was not clearly delimited in the hand press period. So statements relating to printing frequently appear prominently on early printing materials, reflecting the tendency of printers to function as more than solely manufacturers. So DCRMC says the rule is basically if there is not a separate manufacturing statement and you have a statement related to so what I'm trying to say is if you only have a statement that refers to a printer and you don't have any separate statement of publication, you are asked to treat that printing statement as a statement of publication. So in RDA and in DCRMC, you would include the 264 with the subfield 1, which is the subfield for publication, but you would not have a separate 264 with the subfield, I'm sorry, not subfield, the indicator 3 for manufacturer. Next, it's good to know that atlases were previously cataloged in MARC as monographs and not as maps. So if you're looking at older records in OCLC, you may find monograph atlas records. You might also see 2 records for an atlas title. So one of the records for the atlas would have the atlas catalog as a monograph and one as a map. So it's a good idea to form a local policy about whether you will accept Atlas monograph records if an Atlas map record is not available, and how you'd like to handle these types of resources that aren't available for map description. And new original cataloging of atlases in OCLC should use the map record format. We haven't talked very much about atlases. I want to say that atlases are a unique material in that they are both, they act in some ways both as monograph and as map. But it is important that we use the map format record so that we're able to express things like scale, and we're able to bring the resources together under the larger umbrella of cartographic resources. Another thing that's good to think about is that it's important to look outside the lines of a map. So when you're cataloging an early map, it's very important to look carefully outside the neat line. The statements of responsibility and imprints, they're often printed on the corners of the sheet in very small font. I absolutely recommend that people have a magnifying glass or a loupe, some type of way to make the printing more easy to read. It's also important to make sure to turn the map over to see if there's content on the verso. And you may also want to use a light box for watermarks. Watermarks can be used in the dating of maps, and so it's helpful sometimes to be able to hold the resource up to a light box or place it on a light box, although if the material has been mounted on linen, it's very difficult to see those marks. Another thing that's good to know is about architectural photo reproductions. So there are different reproduction processes that were used to create plans and maps and views during the mid-20th century. These include things like blueprints, blue line prints, diazotypes, positive and negative photocopies. These materials are often highly acidic, and special care needs to be taken when housing them. But one of the things that I have found in my own work when working with 20th century materials is that it can be very difficult sometimes to identify what type of printing process was used. And this book that we're showing on the right-hand side of the screen, Architectural Photo Reproductions, a Manual for Identification and Care, is a really wonderful resource to be able to identify what you're looking at. It has a flow chart that, for example, says, asks you what color the ink is. It asks you what color the background is, and then you sort of go to either step 2 or step 3, and it's very helpful to indicate what you're looking at. This information is brought out generally, again, in the 007 field about the material being a positive or negative photocopy, and then further granularity can be brought out in a 500 note. So you probably are familiar with the blueprint, which is shown in the left-hand top corner of the screen. Two other examples are the blue line print and the diazotype. The diazotype is one that is can have different color inks. So you may see a bluish ink, you may see brown ink, and these again tend to be highly acidic, and they require either special housing or special preservation methods, so if they're not actually touching the other resources within your collection. So one of the things that can be really challenging when you're working with early maps is that they're often undated, and this can make determining a date of publication or creation. In MARC, this is the 264 subfield C. It can make this really difficult. So one of the ways that I tend to estimate dates is based on the contents of the map. So for example, the presence of the landmark. I know that if I'm working with Brooklyn and I see a map where it should have a Brooklyn Bridge, but it doesn't, then I know that I at least have a certain date that the map couldn't have been created after. And then you can further make decisions based on things like annotations, watermarks, which may indicate, I've seen watermarks that indicate a date that the paper was created, so that gets you a little bit closer. Life dates of the map maker or publisher, typography. You become more used to the style of certain map makers. So for example, the Coltons in the 1800s, they made a lot of different kinds of railroad maps, and those maps have a very distinctive look, as do certain road maps. So this is helpful to give you a sense of who the map maker might be and what era that person was working in. When in doubt, conjectured date ranges can be used if giving DCRMC. RDA is less I guess, flexible when it comes to date ranges. It's allowable, but it's a little bit more loose in DCRMC. And I wanted to mention quickly about gas maps. So if you're working with 20th century gas maps, these were maps that were distributed mostly by gas stations or gas companies. So Shell, Sinclair, these maps often have an alphanumeric code that is very small in terms of its font, and it will be, again, in the corners of the individual maps. These correspond to a dating system that was used by the publisher. For example, the publisher H.M. Gusha and Rand McNally, and this can be researched online. There are folks that have done really great bibliographic work to figure out what those codes mean. So we have an example here of 149034. That sort of doesn't sound like anything that would be helpful for us, but if you go onto the online information about Rand McNally, this corresponds to the year 1951. So conjectured dates in DCRMC, this is very similar to what we had in ACR2. So we have probable dates and terminal dates and certain and probable decades and centuries. So you're able to, if you're not sure when the map was created, be able to make some sort of educated guess. You can also make a guess based on the photographic reproduction process, if that has occurred. So for example, if you're looking at a blueprint, you know that it wasn't created in the 1800s. It absolutely was created in the either 1900s or the 21st century. So that's one way that you can get a little bit closer to the date as well. So we'll talk about creating map cataloging workflows. Map cataloging is a very specific type of work, and I find that when I've worked as a cataloger, I haven't always had the resources that I needed to get this work done. And as a manager, I also had to be really cognizant of the fact that map cataloging has some specific requirements. And then when you add in the rare component of the materials, it makes it even more complicated. So first is that you identify which cataloging standard you'll be using. And I think it's really helpful to group like items together. And I like to do this by geographic coverage first and then by genre. So if I'm working with maps of Chicago, and then I have maps of various geographic entities, in Europe, I'm going to put those two together into separate piles, and then I may separate them by genre, I may separate them by date. I just find that it helps me to go more quickly if I'm not moving from different areas of the world. And if you're using DCRMC, determine if you'll be creating minimal or full level records. And then the next part is very important. You want to determine a workflow with your preservation department in your institution or your conservator or whoever within your institution is doing that work before cataloging begins, because I guarantee that you will be working with materials that require some sort of either preservation or conservation. And it's important to determine what your physical processing procedures will be before your cataloging begins. So for example, are you barcoding the materials? Are you writing call numbers in pencil on a resource? Are you labeling after encapsulation? When is encapsulation happening, etc. And you also want to make sure that you don't sort of encapsulate yourself into a corner. If you receive your materials and they have been already encapsulated on 4 sides, that can make your cataloging more difficult because you can't actually access the resource in the same way as if you didn't have it in Mylar. So that's one thing to think about as well. You want to prioritize your cataloging based on high value collections and or institutional need. I take care of low-hanging fruit first, and I save more difficult titles for later. I find that just makes my cataloging day go a little bit easier until I've reached the point where I have to catalog all the difficult titles. And I set cataloging targets, but I understand that rare cataloging can often take longer than anticipated. So it's really important to communicate often with your cataloging staff for updates to see how they're doing. Do they need more help with any problems that are coming up? Do they need to be able to go to another institution to do research or receive something through ILL in order to get the bibliographic information about the resource that they may need? And lastly, but this is very important, is that map cataloging takes up a surprising amount of space. You really want to make sure you have enough room to accommodate maps in your cataloging and processing areas. And you also want to make sure that if you're the cataloger or if someone else is the cataloger, that you have a good physical setup. I have cataloged maps that were the length of entire rooms that would have to be rolled out on the floor. I remember once we had to actually close our reading room in order for me to roll out this very, very large map and catalog it. We also have resources that may be many sheets that have been assembled together, and so when you actually unfold the resource, it's much larger than you think it's going to be. So it's important that you have a physical setup that's as ergonomically safe as possible, and also safe for the materials. So we have a list of selected online resources that you can use. And thank you, that is the end of my presentation.
All right, thanks, Caroline. This was a really great presentation, and we do now have about 8 minutes for questions. So if you have not done so yet, please go ahead and start typing your questions into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. We have had a few come in already, so we can go ahead and get started on those. The first one is, you did mention the use of the 590 note, but for original cataloging of imperfect copies, could one instead use a 500 note with a subfield 5 with their institution code?
Yes, you absolutely can. That is the process generally that I would use if the imperfect copy impacts the bibliographic description in any way. So if I do not have access to a perfect copy, I'm working with an imperfect copy, and there's a portion of the map missing, for example, I would use the 500 with the subfield 5 in order to let other catalogers know that my particular copy was missing this portion, and that there may be content that is not in my bibliographic record as a result.
Great, thank you. And the next one is, how did you store the really huge rolled map once it was cataloged?
Oh gosh, in a terrible way. So this was the Brooklyn Historical Society, and this was a situation, this was a manuscript map. It was stored rolled in an archival box, so it was stored flat. Obviously, if you have flat files, that's the best thing. This was such a large piece, it had to be stored in its own enclosure. But one of the problems with cataloging resources that are actually difficult to use is that if any individual actually came into our reading room and asked to look at that map, I don't know how we would provide access to it. So in some ways, the cataloging of it was helpful for the institution to know that we have the resource, but putting that catalog record into the world and saying you can come and look at this resource was kind of I don't know that we would have actually been able to provide access in a safe way.
Okay, thank you. The next one is, we're combining RDA with DCRM and putting both codes in the 040. Is that a best practice?
So I have not actually heard of people doing that. My initial response would be that is probably not a best practice that I would use, but also the issue with DCRMC not being RDA compliant makes it sort of a gray issue. So I think that would be a question that I would pose to other folks in the map cataloging community. There is a classification and cataloging group within MAGIRT, which is the Map and Geospatial Information Roundtable section of ALA, and that might be a question actually that they are dealing with right now. So I can research that particular question.
All right, thank you. And then we do have a follow-up. Just the person who asked the original question does want to add that the PCC BibCo standard record does say to do that.
Oh, okay. Well, I apologize then.
Okay.
If the PCC says to do it, then I assume that it's kosher.
All right. So another institution has about 200 pre-19th century maps to catalog. Is there a map cataloging class out there that you would recommend? This institution does rare book cataloging, but it is out of their usual comfort zone. And so are there any classes or resources you can suggest?
So there are a number of good resources, and I'm not sure where one of my slides went, where I might have just passed through it really quickly. There are two resources that I would direct you to. One is the Map Catalogers Toolbox, and the other is the Map Librarians Toolbox, which is through WAML, which is the Western Association of Map Libraries. Those are two guides that are really helpful for going sort of field by field and finding out what the variant description formats for each MARC field are. In terms of, there are also lots of presentations that are available online. I know Paige Andrew, who's at Penn State, has a number of really great ones. If you Google his name or contact him, he might have more information about actual workshops. I think that they have had a map cataloging workshop previously at the RBMS annual conference or pre-conference, but I don't know that those materials are available online, but I can look more into that.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, do you recommend recording the code for the gas maps as in your example? If
Yes.
So, where should we put the code for the gas maps in the MARC record? Should it be in a note field or somewhere else?
Yes, so I do recommend that. So I would put the 264 subfield C in brackets, and then I would include a 500 note that says something like, you could either just put, most map catalogers will just put the date code, and we sort of understand as a map cataloging community that that's where that date comes from. But you could also be more explicit and say the date of publication, conjectured, or whatever word you want to use, from, and then put a colon and then put the date code.
Okay, thank you. And then we just have kind of a conversation more so going on in our questions box, referring back to the RDA combination question. The original person that asked it suggests that by combining the two, they end up being able to use RDA dates and do away with abbreviations.
Mm-hmm.
And then for anyone who has more questions about map cataloging, there's a suggestion to contact MAGIRT via ALA Connect.
Right, that's MAGIRT, and MAGIRT is a great organization. They have a lot of education resources that they provide, and they do have meetings at both ALA Midwinter and at Annual.
And then finally, we do have a suggestion on courses. When one of our attendees here did attend the Rare Book School cataloging course in Charlottesville, their instructor did have them use the RDA in their DCRMC records. So thank you to everyone who helped participate in answering of those questions. And that does look like that actually wraps up any questions that we have. So we'll go ahead and wrap up the end of the webinar. Thank you again to Carolyn for this fantastic presentation. We are really glad that everyone could be with us today. And you will soon receive a short online evaluation form. So if you could please take a few minutes to respond to those questions. Your comments are valuable and do help our continuing education committee plan future events. That email will also include links to today's slide and recording, and you do have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance. That information will also be in the email. And thanks once again to our presenter, Carolyn Hansen. This was an excellent presentation. Thanks also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Felicity Dykes and Catherine Balick, and to Alana Warren from the ELECTS office. The support that they provide make it possible for us to present these webinars. ELECTS also has other continuing education events coming up. We have a full fall webinar season underway. Our next webinar will be Wednesday, October 16th on a field guide to digital preservation. And that webinar will serve as the first in our 3-part series on a compass for digital frontier. Please see the ELECTS website to register or find more information on these. And ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be on October 15th, discussing team building and technical services. Please check the website for information on upcoming courses and these discussions. Once again, thank you to everyone for joining us today, and this will conclude our session.